Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. But the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things.
So I was a youngster, 10 years old, in 6th grade in Spokane, Washington. And in 1969, which the film was shot in October of 67, by early 69, this was March 1st, at one of the first public showings of the film to a public venue. The kids were all abuzz because there had been this newspaper advertisement for this upcoming showing on the next Saturday. So this just captured my imagination. I mean, I'd never heard of Bigfoot previously. Convinced my dad we had to go see this. He and I and my younger brother went to the Spokane Coliseum, sitting on the 3rd row. You know, Roger comes out onto the stage and introduces himself and his documentary that showcased that 60 seconds of film footage, which we saw over and over and over on a giant screen, you know, in the auditorium there, much larger than life. And wow, what an impression that made.
Rest in peace, Dr. Meldrum. You are missed and loved by so many. You brought a credibility to a subject that would have never had it without your presence.
It looked like somebody was bent over and had their head in the window of the deer blind, and it either heard me or smelt me, and he pulled his head out of the tent and stood straight up, and that shocked me. They don't make people that big.
The way it moved, almost as if it was gliding across the beach. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. They were screaming at each other in gibberish. It sounded like a language, and they were chuntering away back and forwards, back and forwards, back and forwards. I know what a bear looks like, and there is no way on this planet that what I saw were bears.
What are you reporting?
Jesus Christ, you better...
Sir?
See ya!
Hello?
Get somebody out here.
What's going on now, sir?
That son of a bitch is about 6'9", I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Uh-oh.
This is Jeff Meldrum, and you are listening to Sasquatch Chronicles.
This is part 2 of remembering Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who devoted his life to the pursuit of knowledge at the intersection of science and mystery. A respected anthropologist and professor at Idaho State University, he became widely recognized for his groundbreaking research into primate locomotion and the biomechanics of walking. Yet it was his willingness to explore questions that many academics dismissed. His expertise in biomechanics and human bipedalism laid the foundation for many of his studies. Perhaps best known for his work with the Sasquatch or Bigfoot, Dr. Meldrum approached this subject with the same rigor, skepticism, and scientific integrity that defined his career. When you hear the term mid-tarsal break, that term comes from one man, Dr. Meldrum, on the Sasquatch foot anatomy.
So anyway, the heel comes up, weight's transferred through the entire forefoot, and if the substrate is of proper consistency, there's the word I was after, proper consistency, and there's the sufficient forward impulse, it will sometimes push up that speed bump you see, that pressure ridge behind, or sometimes the substrate yields and it pushes a whole disc back into the heel.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So you get a pressure disc instead of a pressure ridge. But you notice there's not a whole lot of imprint of the toes. Most of the forward impulse comes from the forefoot. The toes are there for traction if necessary, but if not, they are pretty much passively extended and serve other purpose. In describing this, I mean, I'm quite confident in what I've described to you because you can watch it take place in the foot of Patty on the film. You can see her heel come up first and almost reach verticality. And if it was a stiff artificial foot, a rigid prosthetic, then the rest of her foot, given the orientation of the heel, would have to stick 8 inches straight into the ground. But it's not, it's just bent. It's flex. And we call that the mid-tarsal break. Not in the sense of like breaking a stick or damaging, but an axis of flexion, a strike of a flexion, a break. And that is the most fundamental distinction between a Sasquatch footprint and a human footprint. Now, you don't find that feature in every print because it just depends on the circumstances. Otherwise, I mean, some prints are flat as can be, but some, if they're moving, if they're changing direction, I mean, if you have experience running, or if your listeners are runners, you've heard of the terms pronation and supination.
Yeah.
So
I have a pronation problem when I run.
Yeah, exactly. And so when the foot is pronated, the arch is depressed in the human foot.
Yeah.
And likewise in the Sasquatch foot as well, because that midfoot is mobile. It doesn't lock into a longitudinal arch. So their feet, when pronated, leave sometimes this flat, featureless print, like the two that Roger cast, which the specialist said,
where is this one from?
This is from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. This is one of the 10 when Titmus came back down to investigate.
Oh, right. You said this. You said this. See, they did the Titmus and the Gimlin and the Patterson.
Yes, I know.
I get all thrown around, man.
So Bob Titmus was actually a taxidermist. So he knew anatomy well.
Sure.
He was the one who actually instructed Jerry Crew on how to make a plaster cast. Jerry Crew showed up at his taxidermy shop with this piece of cardboard that he had cut out with his penknife in the shape of the footprints that were around his caterpillar, and said, "What could have made this?" And he goes, "I have no idea. I've never seen anything like that." He said, "But hey, if they show up again, take this bag of plaster with you and mix it up and make a few days later, he shows up in town with this 16, 17-inch footprint. And, that's where the story came. But anyway, I was going to say, critics have looked at that, despite the fact that you can watch the dynamic action of the foot on the film. They say, well, if that's the case, if that's not just a branch in the sand or something, then why just that one footprint? Why do all the rest? Well, it's really interesting because if you I've got 3D scans of the 10 footprint series that Titmus cast, rotate them 90 degrees, and boom, 8 out of the 10 have a observable pressure ridge. And then on top of that, I got to tell this. On top of that, I had a chance to go actually see the original Jerry Crew footprint from 1958, which when you see in the books, the picture was taken by a newspaper reporter with an old-fashioned flash bulb. If you remember those days, and a very strong illumination, which tends to make things look flat. Well, I took that original cast, took it out of the little shadow box they had it displayed in. You turn it on its side, and guess what? It has a pressure ridge just
Lots
like
of
that.
depth.
It's just a little more subtle than that, not quite as pronounced. I went to China and to investigate the Chinese Yeren. There was a witness who had a sighting and had tracked it. He was actually a park ranger at the time. Found footprints where it had squatted down next to a spring, made a right and a left cast. They were going to unveil those for me to look at and evaluate. They before we did that, they wanted to set up for the interview and capture my initial reaction to it. But I had given Mr. Yuan, the witness, my article, which actually was the paper on the ichnotaxonomy, which featured this particular print quite prominently in a figure that showed it with three angled views to illustrate the form of the pressure ridge. He couldn't speak English, couldn't read the paper, but he saw that picture. Oh man, he got excited.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, sure enough, he opens up his little travel suitcase and out comes the toweling, out come these two footprints. And guess what? They're dead ringers for this.
Really?
Right down to the exact orientation and position of the pressure ridge. So the same species. I mean, that's why I'm convinced that the Chinese Yeren is the representation of the population of origin of Sasquatch that then emigrated to North America. Or when you say emigrated, extended its range as available habitat presented itself into North America.
Dr. Meldrum's research, which included the analysis of footprints and other physical evidence, challenged the conventional boundaries of what would be considered credible science. His willingness to entertain questions beyond the mainstream, coupled with his relentless pursuit of the truth, earned him both supporters and critics, but never diminished his commitment to his work. John Miezinski, who is a wildlife biologist, author, and longtime friend of Dr. Meldrum, reflects on his passing.
Many fond memories. I think I liked camping out with him quite a lot. We had one trip in the Wind Rivers where we were following up on some sightings that had been occurring in one area, Wind River Range in Wyoming. Been a lot of sightings over the 40 years I'd been working in that area, so I was familiar with them. And we camped out and had a great time. We fished in a lake. We stayed up telling stories by the campfire. And this is a highlight in a very subdued way, but just the camaraderie that I had with Jeff was something he had with many other people. He was so easy to relate to. And, I spent most of my life deeply involved in scientific adventures, and so did Jeff. And I think being able to talk to a real scientist in a down-to-earth way around a campfire was one of my best memories of knowing Jeff over those, more like 27 years I've known him. He did have a sense of humor, for sure, and I certainly appreciated that. We would joke, have good times like that. But for me personally, I enjoyed the scientific conversations we'd have that would go on. And I think some of my favorite memories besides being around a campfire was driving to locations with him to do some kind of expedition to follow up on sightings, or to set out trail cameras back when we thought that was going to really solve the whole problem. And, just we'd talk for hours about issues, how to treat something in a scientific way without catering to the kind of tabloid press hubbub out there that was always after us to say things we weren't really in a position to talk about. I think just sitting in the passenger seat and Jeff driving, he usually drove, but sometimes I did to a location and having these conversations that would take us into new places where we think about things that we hadn't thought of before to include in our research programs. I think even above the humor, which was certainly a great addition to our conversations, I like the science and how he treated science. He was the consummate scientist. There were several people who really pioneered the science of Sasquatch research. Jeff was one of them. I think you could include Grover Krantz for sure in there before Jeff. And I worked with Grover prior to knowing Jeff. And there was John Bindernagel, who you mentioned, who was also a good friend of mine. And we went camping together also outside of Sasquatch adventures. We just enjoyed camping together. So Jeff was able to break the barrier with pure science, publications, journals, and organizations to where he could do a presentation on a subject that if anybody else presented it without his eloquence of presenting the science to back up a statement, it wouldn't be accepted. And he was able to put together all of the facts in a clear, understandable way that supported any of the statements that he made. And part of that, so often people would make statements, but they didn't have the background that Jeff had in science and his ability to communicate science, where they could find ways to discredit it. And you could never do that with Jeff. The things he published in respectable journals and that he wrote in his field guides was all backed up by irrefutable science. He and Grover Krantz was able to write and speak that way, but I think of all of them, we all respected, including John Bindernagel, we all respected Jeff's ability to communicate the truth of Sasquatch and its role in the evolution of bipedalism in primates. And also, he didn't get angry when people would try to refute him with not really understanding what he was saying. They would try to refute him with things they had read in the tabloid press as a basis for their argument. And he would very calmly and with a smile point out the facts and the research and the data that he had to back up what he said. And often he would convert people at least to a point where they were willing to accept the topic, if not believe that there is a primate out there. But, believing that it's a legitimate research topic was something that I think Jeff was able to convey to non-believers, to people who were quick to condemn the whole subject. Natural mentor, really, because he didn't show any superiority. He wasn't standoffish as an academic. And sometimes Grover could come across that way. Not that he was, but he could come across that way because he would use a lot of technical language and not reach down to a level of understanding that most people have about primate evolution. And Jeff could have done that because he was the expert on bipedalism in primates. And he had all that technical jargon in his head, but he would explain every word so that a person could understand it with such a gentle demeanor that you didn't want to back off from his academic credentials, which were outstanding. So I think it's a tremendous loss that will not be replaced. But, in a different way, I felt that way about the passing of John Bindernagel. I talked to him just a few days before he died, and he was looking to Jeff to carry on, the candle in the darkness for this whole Sasquatch research subject on a scientific level. And now I don't think there will be anybody that can replace Jeff. I may be surprised, but there will be others that will take up the torch, hopefully, and use Jeff's supply of literature and videos and lectures that he had accomplished in his life to keep this a legitimate science and maybe get funding. Funding was always a problem for us, and Jeff was able to get good funding because of his ability to present things in a way that people who would write off the subject would do a turnaround and say, this is an interesting subject, maybe the most interesting scientific endeavor we have on this planet.
Treat a man as he is, and he will remain as he is. Treat a man as he could be, and he will become what he should be. A mentor is someone who sees more talent and ability within you than you see in yourself and helps bring it out of you. I have said privately many times that if I was not as close to John Bennernuggle as I was, I would not be half the man I am today. Beyond his professional contributions, Dr. Meldrum will be remembered as a mentor, teacher, and kind soul who inspired countless students and researchers to look deeper, question further, and never be afraid of unpopular ideas. His legacy endures not only in his published works and field research, but in the spirit of curiosity he nurtured in others. I had no idea that Lucy's tracks had a mid-tarsal break. Dr. Meldrum on the skepticism and challenges.
I mean, I must say I was kind of in a vanguard of graduate students that were taking particular interest in hominin bipedalism, in part because of the impact, as I mentioned, of this burgeoning of the hominid fossil record. Prior to that, there were fewer individuals who were sufficiently versed in those aspects that they would have recognized. And even today, I mean, even now, the people attempt. The famous Laetoli tracks of East Africa that Mary Leakey discovered that have been at least tentatively attributed to Lucy's type show a pressure ridge, but not all recognize that as for what it is. And I've made the case very strongly. The accumulation of evidence and of published studies and so forth, not just on the footprints, but on the foot skeletons of these early hominins, have now finally acknowledged that these hominins walked on flat, flexible feet with a non-divergent big toe. See, that struck them as having a weird combination. Why would you lose divergence of the big toe unless to incorporate it into an arch?
Oh, I see.
See? And my argument was, no, you're getting the cart before the horse. Why would you keep a divergent big toe in a bipedal terrestrial hominin that doesn't climb around in the trees for its resources anymore? Because that's a feature that appears late in development. When you look in utero, the fetal development of an early fetal chimpanzee, its foot looks much more like a human than it does once it's born.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So it would stand to reason that if you were going to make an evolutionary jump to being bipedal, right, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to get that big toe in a more efficient place.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the idea. And in fact, some apes that walk facultatively bipedal, that is, they can walk bipedally, although they're not well adapted. They will line up their big toe with the direction of travel, because that works the best for the ankle and the midfoot joints. And then they end up supinating their foot into a position where the lateral digits are lined up. But there's still some idiosyncrasy, so it's not a real strong tendency. But to your original point, all of these things started to correlate together, and it begs the question then, what was the inspiration for if these were hoaxed to include a feature? And some have argued, oh, well, it's just a byproduct of walking on a flexible artificial foot. Well, there was one fellow, and now his name just for the moment slips my mind. It'll pop back in. Crowley.
Okay.
Crowley, who made some artificial feet out of latex rubber, strapped him to his feet, his shoes, and then, he went walking on the beach, took pictures. All you do is juxtapose examples and his so-called, his pressure ridge that just results from the flexibility, the random flexibility of this foot, this fake foot, moves all over the place because it's not constrained by an underlying skeleton. It's just an artifact of a flexible foot.
Right.
And depending on how his foot shifts in relationship or whatever, his pressure ridge, yes, there's a pressure ridge, but it's never in the same place twice. Whereas these are remarkably consistent because they're constrained by the underlying skeleton. There's two bones in this transverse tarsal joint, the talonavicular. The talus is the ankle bone, and then the bone directly in front of it, and the cuboid and calcaneus. The calcaneus is the heel bone. So, the ankle bone and the heel bone, those have common names. They're a little more familiar, but the bones directly in front of those two, which end up defining what we call a medial and lateral column of the foot, those two bones are what provide the flexion and rotation of the forefoot relative to the hindfoot that in an ape allow them to climb up trees. And then when they're on the ground, they can still provide leverage through the heel. But see, when you're climbing up a tree, the reason to have that flexibility, when you're climbing up the tree, your foot has a dual function. The forefoot is prehensile. It grabs. And the hindfoot is propulsive. It's the lever, with the fulcrum not up at the ball of the foot, but at the midfoot where the foot has that. So it can lever while still maintaining a grip. Unlike us, what are our options? If you've ever watched a Hawaiian shinny up a palm tree, you have to put your feet, like a duck.
You have to kind of like spread it.
Yeah. None of them tries to spread their big toes really to wrap around but all that has to do with the foot. So when the foot comes to the ground, it still has that midfoot flexibility. Even if the toe is no longer divergent, there are actually advantages to keeping that. And hominins walked on flat, flexible feet for a long, long time. For the Sasquatch, what an elegant adaptation that lets it walk up steep slopes still with a lot of toe length for prehension, but then it can have that flexible instep.
To get its weight just kind of over.
Right, yeah. Right. I mean, the mental image to think of is you go off trail, you're hiking up a hillside. You almost have to resort to like a mountaineer with crampons going up a glacier. You stick your toes in because you can't bend your foot. And then especially if it's constrained by, the modern hiking shoes are much different than in years past when you used to wear.
But you can't get the right leverage.
Right. So what you end up either turning and walking like a
side
duck,
hill,
or you switch back, just, cut trail switchbacking back and forth so that and then you're just dealing with the pronation, supination aspects of it. But this creature has a foot that allows it to walk right up those hillsides with remarkably improved efficiency over a human. So it's a tremendous adaptation for the habitat they're reportedly existing in.
Dr. Meldrum really was our secret weapon for skeptics and scientists. Bobo from the podcast Bigfoot and Beyond speaks about the loss of Dr. Meldrum.
I mean, I consider him a friend, he told me a couple of years back that he considered me a friend, which was a huge compliment. I thought maybe was a little too wild for him in my younger days when I first met him. But yeah, I met him in 2003 at the Willow Creek Museum, the Bigfoot Museum. When they did the grand opening there, and it was like, it was my ultimate fanboy moment of my life. there's Meldrum, John Green, Dr. Bindernagel, Dmitry Bayanov, a few other luminaries like Ron Moorhead, and just all these big name guys. And it was just like, wow. And yeah, I stayed in touch with Meldrum, ever since, and I've got to spend some time with him. He was just such a gracious guy, and he was just so intelligent. And I remember when he first started doing the lecture circuit, people would be like, "Oh, he's boring." Like, people would leave his lecture. I'm like, the guy's hilarious. Like, he uses some scientific terms, like up your vocabulary a little bit. Just listen to the guy. He's full of knowledge, and he was willing to share that knowledge with everybody. He listened to you if you went to an event, and he'd talk to everyone there. He'd listen to the same questions, answer the same thing over and over, and with a smile on his face. And he was always enthusiastic about the subject. When he got going, he'd always get wound up. Like when you'd hear his voice start talking quicker and stuff. And he was fun. He was fun to hang around. He was a funny guy. Like, I don't think he got enough credit for that, but he was had a real dry wit. I think personally for me, it's the same as a lot of people, whether you knew him or not, was we all quoted him. We all threw him out as like, well, Dr. Meldrum discovered this, and Dr. Meldrum, he's from Idaho State University, and he's an anthropology professor. And, we all he made us all look a little less crazy, for one thing, when my parents heard him speak about it, Sasquatch, and saw on some documentaries or whatever TV shows, they that guy's, someone that is very compelling, like from a skeptic's point of view. He gave all this a little more credibility in a subject that was seriously lacking in a lot of credibility with the general public. And like from the woo people, like the furthest out woo to like the biggest apers, the whole spectrum of what it could be, they all quote Meldrum. Everyone quotes Meldrum and uses him as like, they hated the fact that he was not like, down for any like kind of paranormal things associated with the Sasquatch or anything like that. They'd still quote him, like everyone always used his data and what he taught us about. And he was just so gracious and so giving. Like, I just got to thank the guy for, just being so willing to share his knowledge, like repeatedly over and over to like, he got through to so many people. They did those speaking engagements all over. He did tons of podcasts. I mean, he really shared what he knew with as many people as he could. He wrote 4 textbooks that all the universities around the country in Canada and like Western, universities used on the foot morphology and the adaptation and evolution of the foot, from, the Australopithecine to now Homo sapien. He was just an absolute, like leader in that field, besides the Bigfoot stuff, just like the academics. But then he taught himself, he had, their professors and stuff, tutoring him, but, he taught himself genetics and how to do all that, like the lab work with, getting DNA. He could talk really well about the, structure of the eye and why Bigfoot's like, like about reflective, the properties of the eye morphology that would be required. People report glowing eyes, and he could go into great detail, like an ophthalmologist almost, on eye structure and what this means and that means. And he broadened, and he was learning a lot about hair morphology, and he was a constant student. He was always learning and upping his game for sure. He was a brilliant man. I'd say if I had to sum up Jeff, he was kind, he was compassionate, he was very patient, he was incredibly bright, and was just a solid, good person. Like do no harm. Like that was his motto. And he was fun to be around. And he was always a student. He was willing to take listen to you and listen to your. And he would consider what you had to say. He might not go along with it, of course, but he would listen to you. And a lot of people like from the whatever you want to call it, the woo side of things. Like there's more to the Sasquatch than meets the eye type thing. He always said, like, whatever evidence you have, I'd gladly review it and look at it. He said, but I have to deal with evidence. I'm not, gathering stories. I'm trying to get physical data. Like things like that, things that I can quantify and observe and test, that sort of stuff. But yeah, he was, just like I was going to bring that up earlier, was like, just like Dr. Bindernagel, they were both very humble. If they weren't, I guess, like Grover, Grover passed it. For those who don't know, Grover Krantz was a Washington State professor who got involved in like 1969 with the cripple footprints, and he got really deep into it. And when he passed away in the late 90s, he passed the torch on to Jeff. And so Jeff, and Jeff spoke about it quite a bit. He was like, he always would mention, like, I hope someone, really, because there's a lot of PhDs and scientists and professors and stuff that that are interested, and some of them even have had their own experiences, know they're real, but they're not willing to risk those research dollars, or get a crazy reputation where they're not getting any grants or endowments. Jeff was really hoping there would be that kind of academic that came along, but he said, there was no one that really stood out, that really, was dedicated, would dedicate their life, their life works to it, their professional academic life work to it. And he's like, well, Cliff's like the next best thing. Cliff's he's on par with my, guys that are getting their PhDs. He can discuss that aspect of it right there with them, no problem. And he can identify the physical features in the foot and what this and that means. And I mean, Cliff's wrong. He's been fooled before. He admits it, and he's not perfect. It's just as Dr. Meldrum, like a lot of people like to point out, he had a few, where he had the wrong take on a couple pieces of evidence, and they just, hounded, like they still bring it up. I was like, it was 15, 20 years ago, and he admitted oh yeah, well, and upon further review, I stand corrected, and he just, he was, really humble, and you'd want that guy to be your next door neighbor.
And Bigfoot and Beyond did a nice tribute to Dr. Meldrum. I would encourage everyone to go over and check it out. Many years ago, I was talking with John Bindernagel, and we got on the subject of Meldrum. And I'd never heard of Meldrum's encounter, but I remember John telling me about it. This is Dr. Meldrum's encounter.
You're in Alberta. You find these footprints left by a very heavy animal.
Right. And so then the flip side of that strategy, after making our presence clearly known by hiking and examining things and riding around even further reach with the vehicles. And we had a drone. He had a big multi-copter drone, so we could explore up and down the river course, which was really nice, and see the sandbar. We could actually identify and see some wildlife footprints from the drone. Then we would stay up late at night. We had a fire pit, a culvert that was turned on its end, and we would routinely stay up quite late in hopes that our activity, our conversation, cooking over the fire would attract attention as well. And sure enough, on the fifth night, something approached camp. We were first alerted by these whistling calls. They were kind of avian. I've not heard a bird call at night. I mean, there are some birds that do sound off at night, and some owls, but this was accompanying the sound of the moose that we mentioned, stomping through the undergrowth and the deadfall and leaf litter and so forth. It was big, and there were the sound of branches cracking, whether it was simply stepping on things or whether it was intentionally cracking things to intimidate us. It wasn't clear, but in one instance, it was quite suggestive of that. There was a member of our group who fancied herself something of an animal whisperer, I'll say. She didn't claim to be psychic or anything unusual, but just had a real knack with animals. And so she was also very gutsy. She gets up and walks beyond the firelight into the darkness towards where the sounds are coming, talking reassuringly and getting, there were no vocalizations of interaction, but it was clearly moving around and agitated. And then it broke a branch or something. It sounded like cracking a baseball bat against a tree trunk. And I'm watching through a night vision monocular without the benefit of recording capability, unfortunately. But I could actually see her and this and her legs started to shake, her knees started to shake. At that point, I mean, whether there was any other influence, I mean, we've talked about the possibility of the production of infrasound and the effects, the physiological effects that can have on you. She retreated back to the campfire. And right at that point, I shifted my position because of the smoke. Had a better vantage down where these sounds were coming from. And something broke from the shadows as seen through night vision and went up the slope across the road and into the shadows on the other side. So if you've seen the Patterson Gimlin film, if you imagine that classic strip of Patty when she goes behind the debris, because the berm, in a similar fashion, this berm catching the firelight was obscuring what I was seeing right up to about mid-thigh. But the rest of the outline, it was just silhouette against because there was no moon up, just starlight and the light-colored gravel of the roadbed and kind of illuminating her, backlighting her, or it. Patty would be her, but it. And but that I could see the low set head on broad shoulders and thick torso. I could see an arm move. And and it was like it was gliding, that smooth, compliant gait, and then it was gone.
How long was this encounter? Oh,
just moments. I mean, if you imagine what would be the equivalent of maybe 8 steps when it emerged, and then, it wasn't bouncing though. I mean, it was just gliding, which gave me pause, because I'm looking and I don't want to read into, am I just seeing some shadow from some effect of the night vision? I'm sitting there looking and I almost didn't say anything because I didn't want it to be overinterpreted. But on the other hand, I wanted them to check out because I knew I had to leave the next morning before sunup. And I said, you guys have got to look for footprints, which they did. And Todd video documented the whole process where they, it was hard ground in this case where it was exposed, where it wasn't under the tree cover, hard ground, weeds and branches and so forth. But they cut the sign. They being Todd and John Bindernagel and this other woman, Sonia, that was there. Broken twigs, disturbed soil, and stones overturned and so forth. And boom, here's the steps. They ran the tape. And I'm watching the video of this process, and I'm thinking, no, because I thought it was on the other side of this little ravine, given its size. Mm-hmm. I thought it was just behind the berm. It wasn't. It was on the opposite bank. But it was so big, standing probably 7.5 feet tall, when Todd filmed Dr. John Bindernagel, he stood where I had been, filmed Bindernagel walk the tape line, the penny dropped. And I go, oh, I mean, that's right. That's where it was. That's exactly what it looked like, except what I saw was another 1.5 feet taller than John. And they found more footprints under in the moss. They were able to track it for like a mile before they lost its sign. And so, good chance that it was indeed. I mean, I can't imagine anyone up there to prank us. Extremely remote. There's only one approach on that road. We were armed, even though it was Canada, we were armed, mm-hmm. had a license to carry a shotgun because bears and cougar are an issue, especially the bears. But, I just don't imagine anyone going to the trouble. I mean, why would, I guess, you could argue, Todd arranged it. This was one of Todd's cohort that came up and
we were mentioning that you get asked about Todd a lot.
Yeah.
And I was like, we don't need to touch on it. I mean, not that you were opposed to it. You just mentioned that we like to have these interviews where they're a little bit less the same sort of questions.
Right.
So we kind of go over stuff like what's something you get asked a bunch.
Right.
But in qualifying and talking about this story, you should mention who Todd is.
Sure. And Todd Standing is a personality, an individual, an investigator who resides in Calgary, Alberta, has gained some notoriety for his activities because he gets out. He's been, he's a bit obsessive compulsive when it comes to this subject. And so he gets out there in the field much more than a lot of people. And there was no question after spending 5 days with him, he's tall, he's athletic, he gets out there. He walked me into the ground, and I was patting myself on the shoulder that I could keep up with him back then. I was feeling bad for Dr. Bindernagel, who was about 8 years my senior, and but he still was quite spry at that time as well. So Todd has gained some
he's like a semi-infamous character, not like infamy in necessarily a bad way, but people have a lot of feelings.
Notorious is a good way to describe for good and bad. I mean, there are people who think that the things that he's done and the things that he has presented are fabulous and fascinating, and there's others who are absolutely convinced that he's a hoaxer and prankster and just carpetbagging, so to speak. And, I don't begrudge someone trying to monetize and turn a profit on their activities in order to sustain their ability to pursue their interests.
Bro, that is exactly what I'm doing now.
Yeah. And he certainly isn't getting rich doing what he's doing. It's not a gold mine. Unless you grab that brass ring, you're the one that brings in the specimen. And even then, it's not, book deals and movie deals and things like that, I guess, that spin off from that kind of accomplishment or exposure. The fallout, but it's going to have a lot of fallout, negative and positive, as well as positive. The negative fallout, dealing with that, if you are the first person to shoot a Sasquatch, you can imagine it's going to be quite a controversial topic.
Long-term investigator and researcher Montreal Withers talks about the first time she met Dr. Meldrum and his impact on the subject.
I had the honor of first meeting Dr. Meldrum. It was about 25 years ago. This was back at the Bigfoot Discovery Museum in Felton, California. I'm not sure if it's even still there. I don't know if it exists anymore. But anyway, my oldest brother Kevin and my best friend Kathy Strain, we were going up to the Willow Creek Bigfoot Symposium, and we'd stopped there at the museum on the way up. And at that time, I was with the BFRO. I was a curator, and so I'd already knew who Meldrum was, and I was like a huge fan of his because he was always just so eloquent, and even everything he would write, was just like so perfect and informative, And so anyway, we stopped at the museum, and he was there. And I'd never met him in person at that point, but I was a huge fan of his. So I was kind of instantly nervous, like I'm going to meet Elvis or something. I was like, oh my God, it's Meldrum, And so I can't remember if somebody introduced me or not, but anyway, I said, oh, Dr. Meldrum, I'm a fan of yours. Everything's, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, call me Jeff. And so, and I just couldn't help it. I was nervous and I kept saying Dr. Meldrum. So he kept reminding me, it's okay, you can call me Jeff. But anyway, so then fast forward, everybody went from there on up to the Willow Creek Symposium. And, he did his talk and everything. And I was just mesmerized because, he's so eloquent. And when he talks, it's so easy to understand what he's saying, even though it's stuff that's very complex. And as intimidated as I was, it wasn't his fault because he wasn't intimidating at all. It was just me being a dork, and being a fan. But anyway, so I got to see him talk up there. And then I'd run into him every time we went to a conference. He was always there. And he was just such a nice, easy to talk to, humble person. And throughout the years, every once in a while, I'd have something that I wasn't sure about as far as the evidentiary value, prints and such. And so the last time I'd sent him some prints to take a look at was, probably, I think it was 2018 or something. And they were some crazy prints that that I got up at Bumping Lake up in Washington, they were pretty deep in this kind of a sandy soil that was right on the edge of where they had drained a lake. I'd written him and sent him some photos and stuff, and he wrote me back and was telling me what he thought of them. And he was thinking they were probably human because they were more narrow. But it was always so nice to have him as a resource. And I was so lucky to be able to be in contact with him just kind of whenever needed. He was there for anybody who had any kind of evidence they wanted to run by him just to get his opinion or something. He was just so available. It's really tough to think that he's gone. I still kind of haven't digested it yet. It's just, there's just such a hole in the Bigfooting community now that everybody, I think, including myself, we just kind of took for granted. He had this way about him. It was such eloquence that he could communicate these really complicated ideas, about anatomy and body structure and such, that pretty much anybody could understand exactly what he was talking about. And, and he would show it on whatever on screen or whatever he had, or, and point out different things that, like you were saying, you'd never know about. But yet, after talking to him, it's just like, yeah, that's totally digestible. I understand exactly what he's saying, and it makes total sense. And he could always back up everything he said with actual evidence. So it's really, there's just nobody like him. And it's just kind of a void now. I don't know if there's anybody up and coming that is anything like Dr. Meldrum, but I mean, those are going to be some really big shoes to fill. I think he really, really helped to make Bigfoot mainstream. Because of his education and his credibility, I think he was able to talk to people, and plus he was on, every TV show I think I've ever seen about Bigfoot. And he just made it so palatable, where it's not what people would think of when they think, oh yeah, here's this crazy person talking about an imaginary creature. You've got this professor with all these credentials who's very soft-spoken and very matter-of-fact and very, very educated, who's talking about it with such resonance. And I mean, he just really, I think he made it so much more believable that even somebody who would scoff at the idea had to really say, well, yeah, maybe he's right, because he just wasn't a nut like what they would think. I mean, back in the day, what was his name? I can't remember. There was a guy that used to be around, and he would always stand up at conferences and say, oh, Bigfoot's a multidimensional, blah, blah, blah. And I can't remember his name right now. But anyway, he was always known as kind of this wacky guy that everybody tried to avoid. He was on David Letterman too, I believe. Of course, now I think people would probably take a second look at him and think maybe he's not so wacky after all. But to have someone like Meldrum be so kind of on the forefront and everybody kind of know who he is, even people that weren't into the Bigfoot genre, was amazing. And he had that ability to take someone who is a complete skeptic and get them halfway there, and that they would go, well, here's this guy and he teaches, he's a professor and blah, blah, blah. He's, maybe there's something to this. So I think for future generations, he's going to be an icon as far as someone who was promoting the probability of Bigfoot and showing everything that he could to prove that it exists.
Those who had the privilege to work with Dr. Meldrum, remembering his unwavering support for new ideas, his collaborative spirit, and his generosity in sharing his expertise. Above all, his genuine love for the natural world and its mysteries served as a constant reminder that science is a journey, one that is never fully finished, but is constantly evolving. Dr. Meldrum shares why he thinks science will not look at this subject, and in his style, he gives you a history lesson.
The norms, the tradition, the convention is that a novel species is demonstrated by physical remains. Something that is diagnostic. It ultimately, in order to establish a type. I mean, it's one thing you come in with a hide or something, but the hide itself, if it's just a cutout hide, unless there's more information like DNA or, a microscopic analysis of the hair or whatever, you need something physical, something that's diagnostic, that differentiates it from other animals. So, a jaw with teeth, part of a skull. Other parts of the postcrania are less differentiating. The subtleties. I mean, sometimes you have different species, say, within a genus of a rodent, and on the basis of the skeleton, you couldn't differentiate one from the other. But the teeth or the skull dimensions and so forth, it can be really subtle. Because when we're talking about a biological species, the thing that separates them into species is their inability to form viable offspring. It's more challenging with fossils, where you're dealing with skeletal remains, and that's the point. Is when you go into these museums, you pull the drawers out, skeletons may look remarkably the same. It's very similar, but you look at the pelage, the skin, and the coloration is dramatically different. Sure. These are the way species recognize each other and the way they maintain barriers between hybridization crosses. Anyway, so you needed something physical. So in the absence of that, see, I've never argued that science should recognize the existence of Sasquatch. I've simply argued science should recognize the legitimacy of pursuing the question of the existence of Sasquatch. You look at the cover of my book, and it has an endorsement from Jane Goodall, the foreword's written by George Schaller, a preeminent naturalist. He doesn't endorse the existence of Sasquatch, but he endorses enthusiastically my pursuit, the justification of my pursuit of the question, positing this question based on the evidence that I have. The effort to bring it down is, again, it's multifaceted, but one of the facets is, given the stigma that is attached to this. And when you look at the history, when you look at the temporal trajectory back in the 60s, the notion of these things existing, when Ivan Sanderson, who was I'm not sure what to call him. He wasn't a PhD, but he had lots of accolades, lots of initials behind his name, lots of different recognitions and memberships and honors and so forth. But he was, when it came to the school of hard knocks, I mean, he was a naturalist, but he also had a very active curiosity about not only topics relating to kind of cryptozoology, but all sorts of different strange things. And that didn't help the perception, obviously. But he was one of the pioneers. His book on Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life, Subhuman Species on 5 Continents, was the subtitle. A tome, an encyclopedic tome, where from his world travels, he collected all of these amazing narratives and evidence. I mean, he's got an appendix. It was all the different footprint reports attributed to these. He called them ABSMs, was his acronym, Abominable Snowmen, ABSM. Anyway, but the point was, he published his book in 1962, right at the height of this single species hypothesis. There can be only one. We're it. And so these others couldn't exist. So you look at the reviews of his book, and it was treated like a work of fiction, fantasy. And as a result, the science pulled back, and into that void comes all of the adventurers, the fortune seekers, and the charlatans, unfortunately. Sure. And that has been largely the case. And so there was an entire generation kind of tainted by that, a generation of academics tainted by that. So we see scientists, young generation of scientists coming up, and I've had, opportunities to visit with some of these on occasions, various circumstances, and they're fascinated. But I tell them, you've got to be careful. You've got to play it close to the vest until you have tenure. Yeah. You cultivate your skills. If you're interested in this, say, and you have, predilection to molecular biology. Get yourself in a position that once you're able, you can do the definitive genetic study on potential samples, or, whether it's bioacoustics, get yourself in a position where then once you have tenure, then you can turn your expertise and your reputation to that problem and really figure out what's making these inexplicable noises, vocalizations. Anyway, it's happening. That's happening. So because of that, of the spillover of that phenomenon has been that it's very stigmatized. It's tabloid. It's pseudoscience, right? And, when you go to find a book about Bigfoot, it's not in the natural history section. It's in the New Age, or not the New Age. It's in the unusual knowledge, unorthodox knowledge. When my book was taken on by Barnes and Noble to be carried as a regular offering, I would occasionally go into a Barnes and Noble and look. And when the book was printed, I was very adamant that, they put the little categorization. I want it to be natural science, And so I'll go and look, and my book was over between Bermuda Triangle and crop circles.
And would you go move it?
Well, sometimes I would. Or if there was more than one copy, I would put one over it. But I went up to the manager one time and I go, hey, why is it over here? It's supposed to be right there next to Jane Goodall's books about chimpanzees. Oh, well, you'll get 10 times the traffic over here in the New Age section.
Really?
That's what she said. And I go, well, that's not the point. I said, okay, keep one there, but put one over there with Jane Goodall so that people who are looking at those kinds of books will see it and recognize that this is about a primate.
It's an academic pursuit. It's not like a work of fan fiction.
Yeah, and I'm not to besmirch there's probably very bona fide objective investigations of crop circles and Bermuda Triangle.
That happens all the time, man.
Yeah. So that's been the problem, is that there's the stigma, and there's this notion that it reflects negatively, this reaction of the department chairman to being chided about the Bigfoot guy. And yet there's so many people who they know of Idaho State University only because of moi, and there are some that recognize that. Yeah. So the director of communications and public relations, who's a good friend of mine, that's his attitude. Anything that you do on this topic, we'll cover.
Matt Pruitt from Bigfoot and Beyond discusses the impact Dr. Meldrum had on this subject.
My favorite memory personally is just, I'd admired him for so very long, starting probably in about 2004, when I first saw him on Mysterious Encounters, Doug Hychek's old show, where I first saw, Bobo and a lot of these people. And obviously I would follow every interview that he gave, and whether that was like print media or radio or, internet radio back in the day, blog talk radio, those sorts of things. And then when his book came out, it had a huge impact on me and was really inspiring and really set to me like a high bar that I've always been at least aiming at. I don't think I'll ever reach it, but it definitely set a standard. So to see him at so many events over the years was always great. I learned a lot from his presentations, and getting to have like brief talks or interactions either after hours or at his table or booth. But last year I did 2 events with him. I spoke with him at Squatch Fest in Washington and at the Ohio Bigfoot Conference. So it was really great to get a lot of extra time, where the speakers are hanging out at dinner before or after the events, or the night before the event starts, everyone gets into town, and we went out to dinner and got to have a lot of like really good conversations, human conversations, not just, brief interactions at a booth or something like that. But it was really intimidating. I guess personally, it was nice because I've been such a student of his by trying to consume, everything that he put out there, from interviews and podcasts and books and papers and presentations that he's given. I learned a tremendous amount from him. And there were a lot of things that I learned that I thought were really applicable to other things that I was pursuing. And so at this panel at Squatch Fest last year, they had us seated in such a way and sort of like an order to who would answer audience questions. And there was an audience question about whether or not there was competition between Sasquatches and black bears, since they're both omnivores. And I was just set to go first. And so I was talking about like temporal niche partitioning and spatial niche partitioning and all these different things. And I realized like, oh yeah, I learned a lot of this from Dr. Meldrum, who's sitting beside me. First of all, it was like unbelievable to me that I would ever be on a panel with Dr. Meldrum. And second of all, as I'm answering, I'm realizing like, oh man, I learned all this from him. And so when I was done, he had a big smile and he's like, well, I can tell somebody's been a very good student. And that just meant the world to me, because I kind of was like, oh man, is he going to say, well, that's what I would have said if Matt hadn't stolen it from me. But he was a teacher, you know, and I think he appreciated that those of us were learning those sorts of things from him and spreading that to other people, and when we were given the opportunity to speak. So that was personally meaningful. But I really just loved watching him interact with people that admired him. He had a tremendous degree of patience. You know, I find that a lot of the people that I admire are such unique individuals that they sort of exist in a bit of a no man's land. And I think Dr. Meldrum existed in that way. And what I mean by that is that, you know, he was obviously very rigorous and studious with his research, and he was very conservative about any sort of claims or propositions he would put forward. Like I don't think he ever said anything hypothetically about the Sasquatch that violated any of the known established axioms or rules of his scientific disciplines. And that made him a very cautious thinker. And so you have this whole set of people who might lean towards more metaphysical or supernatural or mystical interpretations of the Sasquatch, who were frustrated that he didn't share their view. And so there was this big section of the Sasquatch community that those people represent who really pushed against him. And then even on the flesh and blood side, you had these people that were constantly bringing him, you know, blob squatches and, you know, sticks laying on the ground that they took to be like glyphs or whatever. And so he was always cautious, like, well, hey, I don't necessarily think I would call that evidence. And so there was a big section of that group that thought that, well, here's a guy who's just the establishment. He's just, you know, the man, so to speak, and we have to rally against him. But on the establishment side, and I'm sure you know this, and hopefully your audience knows it, he got so much grief for so many years from fellow academics, from people in his department, from people at other departments at Idaho State University. So it wasn't like he was marching in lockstep with the institutions or with academia, you know. And so to the Squatchers, they saw him sort of, or at least a certain subset of the Squatchers saw him as like an ivory tower kind of, you know, figure that was not one of us to be trusted. And then to the academics, like he was this weird outlier because he gave time and attention to the Sasquatch mystery. And so that kind of put him in this unique place. And I respect that a lot because he didn't kowtow to either side. I do think that he always handled at least everything that I saw, both in person and online, as he handled it all like a gentleman, you know. And I saw people be very rude or say really harsh, inflammatory things or cast a lot of blame. And he was always a gentleman to them, you know, and that's a good example. He set a very high standard to try to follow in that he was very diplomatic, a great ambassador. He was open-minded. He would hear people out, and not that he would take abuse, but that he would, you know, handle that in a way that was just remarkable. It's not easy, as you know. You get barraged with things, and it's really, you can understand why a lot of the people of the past, you know, there's no shortage of angry, cynical Sasquatch researchers who just, you know, don't treat people very well. And Party is like, you know, I don't agree, but I understand it, you know. And he always had a very light touch, I would say, with people. And he was super generous. I mean, that's one of the points that kept coming up in our tribute. It was like, you know, if you were to look at all of the output that he gave beyond the papers that he wrote and the book and, you know, these various like formal publications, but I would not be surprised if there are well over 200 podcasts interviews that he's given. There's probably more than that. I've never tried to go tally them all up, but he seemingly said yes to everyone and made time for everyone, which is pretty remarkable because not many people can do that, you know. And the fact that he was a father of 6 with a full-time job and his own pursuits, and he still made time to represent the subject well, that if you really wanted to, any one of your listeners wanted to really get to know who Dr. Meldrum was and what his perspectives were, you could there are easily hundreds and hundreds of hours of him speaking about the subject online. And so for every person that thinks, oh, he was an ivory tower intellectual elitist, it's like, well, really? Because he gave his time to podcasts and YouTube channels with like 15 subscribers. You know what I mean? He's still put himself out there to share the information, obviously for no gain, because it wasn't like they could pay him or that he was going to sell tons of books by being on a YouTube channel with 15 subscribers, but he still always gave of that time, which shows me like at his core, he was a teacher. He loved to teach. And I think a lot of us studied what we studied because of Dr. Meldrum, or even if you've not studied those things, most Sasquatchers are familiar with certain aspects of the Sasquatch foot because they've heard Jeff describe it, or some trickle-down effect of what Jeff described to other people, and then those people go on to describe in other places. And like that sort of foundation that we all stand on, maybe there's a lot of people that don't even realize who laid the bricks in that foundation, but a lot of it was Dr. Meldrum, I wish I had known Dr. Meldrum better. We did communicate via email, and I met him at a lot of events, but I wouldn't dare to say that like, oh yeah, we were friends, because I wouldn't want, for lack of a better term, I feel like that would be a bit of like a stolen valor sort of situation. Before, when we had him on Bigfoot and Beyond the first couple of times, I think then he started to connect my name with the previous communications we did. Like, oh yeah, I remember you. And then when we did those events last year and spent quite a bit of time together, but before that, it would not have surprised or offended me, if somebody was like, oh, hey, my friend Matt Pruitt, and Dr. Meldrum said, who? And so I don't want to give the false impression that he was a close friend. He was a North Star to me. In many ways, not only in his thinking and perspectives, but like we talked about, in terms of the way he conducted himself in public outreach and educating people about the subject. Just a great representative for the pursuit of the Sasquatch, period. And so that was always very inspiring. I gained so much from his work. And so I just consider myself like a super fan and a perpetual student. And yeah, the big message I would want to leave people with is there's so much of his generosity out there that if anybody else is interested in being a student of Jeff's, like that's absolutely possible with how much is on the internet. I put together like a little list, a repository of things, links to the book and his field guides, a number of papers that he published about the Sasquatch that are online, a handful of really long form, very comprehensive interviews, and then a few presentations that were filmed. And that's over at patreon.com/Bigfoot and Beyond podcast. So it's a free post. You don't have to be a Patreon member. You can see it like right there on our front page for free. But anybody who wants to learn from Dr. Meldrum, it's all available to you right now for free on the internet. You can be a student at home, and I would encourage everyone to do so.
I want to thank again the Backcountry Manifesto podcast for allowing me to play the clips. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Tell me, and I forget. Teach me, and I may remember. Involve me, and I learn." In honoring Dr. Jeff Meldrum, we celebrate a life dedicated to knowledge, wonder, and the unyielding search for truth. His absence will be deeply felt, but his voice and vision will continue to echo in classrooms, fieldwork, and all the individuals who admired him. I said in the intro, he gave a subject a credibility that would have never had it without his presence. But after everything, we remember Jeff as a good man. Rest in peace, Dr. Meldrum.